Hey there, this lesson we're going to be talking about consuming inbound webhooks in your Rails application from scratch. We're going to build out the controllers, the models, and the background jobs to process those webhooks. And this is actually from a workshop that I gave at RailsConf 2023 with Colin Loretz. We had about 60 people in the room. We walked through all of this stuff live at RailsConf, which is super fun. But workshops are not recorded, so we couldn't actually share this content with you unless I recorded something like this. And so we're here recording this so you can follow along and enjoy a little bit of RailsConf yourself from home. So this repository from Colin is everything we covered in the workshop. You can follow the README. We'll go create all the controllers, the routes, the models, the background jobs, and so on. And you can follow along at your own pace if you want to check out the README, but we are going to dig right in to building this in our application in Rails. So here I have a brand new Rails app, nothing in it, and we need to go and create our controllers and routes and models and jobs to process our background or process our inbound webhooks with background jobs. So we're going to start out by creating some controllers that are used to receive the webhooks. That's the first place that a service like Stripe, or we're going to be creating an imaginary movie database that sends us a message anytime a new movie comes out. So we're going to have two examples. Stripe, well, where they will send you stuff whenever a customer gets created or charged or whatever happens. And then our movie example that we'll use to kind of fake this out and use as a easily testable example. So we're going to start by generating a controller, and we're going to make it under the webhooks namespace, and we will call this base controller. And this is where we'll define any shared code between all of our webhooks services. One of those things that we'll need for all of them is our base controller needs to skip the CSRF checks. So here we want to disable CSRF checks on webhooks because they do not originate from the browser. So CSRF is basically a issue that happens in your browser where malicious JavaScript could try and send data to your Twitter account from another page. And if that was allowed, basically you'd be able to visit a website, have malicious JavaScript on there, and have it tweeting if you're logged in on another site, which would be bad. So we want to disable this because webhooks come from a whole other service. They don't actually operate in the browser at all. So there's not any tokens or anything we could use to verify CSRF anyways. So we want to disable that here because it is not necessary. So skip before action is what we'll do to say we're going to skip the verify authenticity token step. And I just found out this morning there's the skip forgery protection helper method that will define this for you. And so we're going to use that instead, but this is what we used in the past before this existed. It may have existed a long time. I just actually happened to learn about it this morning. So I'm learning as well as you are. Now, all of our webhooks are going to come in and we want to tell them, hey, we received that. So we're going to need to define a create action for each of these, and it's going to return just a simple status code back to the browser or back to the webhook service. We don't need to actually send them any data back, just a status code for our HTTP response. So by default, that's going to be head OK. It will say, hey, we received this correctly, and you don't need to send it again. So this will be our sort of default create action that we can define in our base controller. You could leave this out and make sure that all of your inherited controllers define the create. We will override this in each of those. But it's nice to have a base create action here just to show what it does. So now we want to generate a webhook controller for a service, and we'll make our Stripe, or actually let's start with our movies controller. So we'll go ahead and do that. This movies controller is going to inherit, instead of from application controller, we want it to inherit from webhooks base controller. And this is going to end up receiving the exact same functionality from the base controller. So skip forgery protection, and the create action. So then in here, we can add a comment for testing. So we can say, let's use curl on the command line to test this out. We can say localhost 3000 webhooks/movies, and then we can give it a content type of application JSON so that Rails knows to process that as JSON. And then we can also do some data. So we can have some JSON in here that's like title, put quotes around that, the matrix, and we'll be able to use this curl command in our terminal to simulate a webhook coming in. So I'm going to actually see if this will all fit on a single line so it's easier to copy paste into your terminal. And once we've added our routes, we'll be able to actually use that and then hit our Rails application. So then we don't need to define the create action in here yet because we're inheriting from the base controller. And then we can also go and create our Stripe controller. And this one I'm not going to make plural because Stripe as the company is not plural. So it'll be matching a little bit better if we make the controller name match exactly. We'll have to tweak the routes a little bit to make sure that that works properly, but we can do the same thing in our Stripe controller. We'll inherit from the Webhooks base controller, and that's really all there is to it. So let me save these two files, and then we can go to our routes file under config routes.rb, and we'll define our routes in here. So let's go and say namespace webhooks, give it a block, and we'll say resource movies controller. We don't need to specify controller on this one, actually. We'll leave that out, and we'll say we only want the create action. Then for resource Stripe, we want to say controller is Stripe. And the reason for that is if we didn't, resource is going to look for the Stripes plural version of Stripe, and we can then tell it to use the singular version so it doesn't pluralize our controller name. Same thing here. They're only going to ever send a post request, so we will only have the create route that is generated, and that's all we need. So then that's going to then map it. So the routes come into here. We have /webhooks/movies/webhooks/Stripe, and then we would tell those services to have those requests. So now if we go to our movies controller and we copy this long curl command, including the ending quote there, and we paste this into our terminal, as long as we have a Rails server, so let's go into Rails-conf webhooks. We'll run Rails server. If you are using the other CSS and JS bundling services or libraries, you can use bindev to run your Rails app. We're not using those in here. So then we can run post request and then look at our Rails logs, and we should see that we got a post request to Webhooks movies. We got the title as the matrix, and then we got a 200 OK response. So that is perfect. That is what we're looking for. We want to make sure that that inheritance is set up so that our base controllers create gives us that head OK, which is a 200 OK. So now we have our routes. We've got our tests so that it's connected to the movies controller correctly. And we can move on to the next step, which is to save those webhooks into the database. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, let's think about this. Whenever we have Stripe bombarding us with webhooks from Black Friday, maybe we are just super successful and we're selling thousands and thousands and thousands of products on Black Friday. Well, webhooks are going to come in from Stripe, and there are going to be a lot of them because it's going to create customers. It's going to add payment methods. It might update payment methods. It might update customers. It might create charges. It might create subscriptions. Subscriptions create invoices. Invoices get paid, and they have charges. And so there are many, many, many different webhooks you might receive from Stripe. that can get overwhelming for your Rails application because your app needs to also serve all those customers who are clicking refresh trying to buy the product. So you want your webhooks to actually be as fast as possible. So the way we do that is we receive the webhook, and then we shove it in the database and have a background job process that. These are things that do not need to happen immediately, so we can take it, stash it in the database real fast, and then have a background job process that. So that's what we're going to do here. So we are going to generate a model called inbound webhook. It's going to have a status, which will be a string, and then we're going to have the body as a text column on here. And that will be our HTTP request body that we'll stash in there. And we can use the status to keep track of which ones are pending, maybe which ones failed and need retries, and also which ones have been successfully completed. And you might use this for doing analytics or other things like that to make sure that, your webhooks have come in and been processed successfully or not. Maybe they need retries. You can keep track of this and decide what to do with them accordingly. So we're going to run Rails DB migrate to create that. And then we can also, and actually before we do that, let me Rails DB rollback. We'll go into the database migrate, and we can set the status to default as pending. So we set a default value for that so that it is marked as pending automatically. And then we'll have our inbound webhook model all ready to go. So we can now run Rails DB migrate to get that new table with the default value. So then our default process for creating a webhook is now going to take the inbound webhook model, and we will create a new one where the body is the payload. And we're going to define a method called payload here to retrieve the request body and read that. Request body comes from rack, and this is an IO string. So it works like a regular string, but it also works like a file. So if you read through this string, it will keep track of where you read until, and then you can't read it again if you finished it. So you would have to rewind and reread that string. So this is why we're going to end up reading it once. We'll save it to an instance variable called payload. And if we ever need to access this a couple times for processing, which we will see in the future, we will have cached it into a variable so that we can load the payload for the first time, and then we don't have to actually reread the request body each time. So this will be the best way to handle that. So we will stash it in our database and then tell the service, okay, thank you. We received that successfully. And then in the future, we will add a background job to actually process this after we have saved it in the database. So now, to do that, we will say Rails generate a job called webhooks movies job, and we will end up creating separate jobs for each of these services because movies will get handled very differently than Stripe webhooks. So we might as well just create a separation out there. If we were to put all this logic into a single webhooks controller, we'd have to figure out, did this come from Stripe? Did this come from the movies? And so we've moved any if statements we might have in this controller to the routes. And then we've also moved any of the background processing stuff into separate jobs. So we don't have to have if statements saying, if it's movies, let's check these things in the webhook data and process it this way. If it's Stripe, do this. We can split them out into separate jobs, separate routes, separate controllers to organize that. And we have a lot less conditionals in our code that way. So our base controller now will have this job that we can work with, and we can go into the webhooks movies job and implement anything we would like in here. So we can, instead of taking all the args in, we can say this is only going to receive an inbound webhook, and we can do whatever we would like with this. So our webhook payload is going to be a JSON parse of the inbound webhook body attribute or column, and we can also symbolize names is true. so that our keys in our Ruby hash that we receive after the JSON parse are symbolized. And then we have this webhook payload that we can do anything we would like with. So for example, you might movies.where webhook payload, maybe we'll say movies title, where the title matches the webhook payload, find or create, something like that. You could do anything you would want with a new movie that came in, and save it in your database, update the values, whatever it might be. So that's all you need to do with that. And then you can tell it once you're done, we can update the status to processed, and that will keep it in the database, change the status to processed, and we can then have a way to clean those up later on, like a cron job that will go through and say, okay, any webhooks that have been processed as of like a week ago, let's go clean them up. The benefit of saving these around is if you get duplicates, you can say, hey, let's look at the inbound webhooks database table and see if there are any duplicates. If we've already processed this, let's just skip it, and we don't even need to queue up the job. So having this extra data in there for a brief period of time is handy. So now let's take a look at building a Stripe job, which is a little bit more realistic than our fake movie service. Our Stripe job is going to be very similar. We're going to have the inbound webhook. We are then going to, for this, do the same sort of thing where we say json.parse inbound webhook.body, symbolize names is true, event equals Stripe event dot construct from JSON. And this, instead of having to work with a Ruby hash, which is representing the JSON, we can actually take that and use the Stripe gem to hydrate a Stripe event object where you can call methods on it. And this is what the Stripe gem provides for us. So we can then go into here and bundle add Stripe to make that available, so we can use that in here. And then our processing can say, let's ask what event type we are processing. What did we receive? One, it's a customer updated event. We want to say find customer and update their details. So maybe we keep track of their default payment method or their name or something in Stripe, and we want to sync that with our application. We can do that. And then at the end, we would say inbound webhook dot update status is processed. We can then add other whens for any other events, like creating a charge. We would find and create that in our database maybe. We would handle subscriptions the same way. And for everything else that we don't actually care about, we can just tell the inbound webhook to update the status to skipped. And that way we can have a way in our database to say, hey, we just ignored these. We don't need them, but we'll skip them and just keep them in the database for a little bit. We might deploy a new change in the next few days that actually does want to process some of those. So we could have those skipped ones kept around for a week maybe, and then reprocess them. We could change them to pending and re-queue up the jobs or whatever we might want to do. But it's nice to, if we receive them, just keep them for a little bit and mark them as skipped. We don't really care about them today, but we might in the future. So this is the basics of this. This will start getting a lot more complicated when your application needs to actually deal with subscriptions and charges and other things. But this is where you would put your code. You would put it right in here. You could add other Ruby classes to do more complex processing. But this is kind of just a placeholder because it's not unique to your webhooks. It's actually stuff that's unique to your application code, not your webhooks. So from here, we need to go into our controllers and we need to queue up that job. Now, our base controller does not know what service it is actually processing. So we need to actually override this create action in our movies controller. So we can put the create in here. We can then say, let's create the inbound webhook. This is going to give us that record for it in return. And then we can say webhooks, movies job, perform later, that record. And then we can return our head OK. So that is all we need to do in order to process our movies. So we'll create the record in the database, queue it up to be processed by our background workers like Sidekick or something, and then tell the request everything was received successfully. We're going to want the same thing in our Stripe controller, and instead of the movies job, the Stripe job, and that will be that. And the important piece that we need to do next in our Stripe controller is that we only want to process the payload if it actually came from Stripe. So there are malicious people out there who are trying to steal your service for free or abuse your service. And so what they will try and do is use your webhook routes and try and say, hey, I paid for that, even though they didn't, and try and steal your service. So the way that we want to do this is we want to actually verify this payload, make sure it came from Stripe when we process this inbound webhook. And this is going to be a different mechanism for every different service that you are going to integrate with. So you'll have to use their documentation to figure out how to best do that for that service. But in our base controller, we want to add a before action to verify the event before we do any create processing. And we can make this a private method here for the payload. And we can also define a default verify event method. And this can just say head bad request. So if we just leave it alone, when we make a test request to our application now, it will hit the before action. It will return a 400 or a bad request response. So you'll see here, if we run our curl one more time, in our Rails logs, we'll get a 400 bad request. And it will say filter chain halted as verify event rendered or redirected. And that's exactly what we did. We rendered a empty response with the 400 bad requests. This is a good secure default to have, and each of your controllers can then override that for however they would need to verify the events that came from that service. Our movie service here is a fake one. So if we were to add a verify event here, we can say head bad request if params fail verification. So we can kind of use a URL query just for testing purposes. So we can have that left out. But if you do add that, it's going to give you a bad request. So now, if we try this again, we'll get it successful, 200 OK. It inserted into the webhooks database table. And if we were to add on our URL, fail verification equals 1, and send that over, this one is going to make the post request. It's not going to create anything in the database, and it's going to give us a 400 back. So it's a way for us to simulate verification failures or not. So it's a handy little trick when you're building out your own test suite. You can build things like this in there so that your test suite can use that to test. Now for Stripe, this is a real service that we can actually integrate with. So our private method here for verify event is going to use some code from the Stripe gem for the verification. So we're going to be able to get the signature. Signature equals request headers, Stripe signature. This is going to be something Stripe adds to the request, and you want to read that and then verify that we can make that signature as well and make sure that they match. So here we will say our request secret. Stripe is going to give every webhook a secret that you will use to verify that the signature came actually from Stripe. So we'll put that in our Rails application credentials, and we'll store that under Stripe and the webhook signing secret keys. So you can now go into your Rails console or your terminal and then run Rails credentials edit, and you would say environment equals production, and you would put in here Stripe and webhook signing secret, and this will be the value that you get from Stripe. So I'll bump the fonts up so you can see that. This is what you will get from Stripe when you create the webhook on their website, on their dashboard. You'll put that in your Rails credentials. You can also use an environment variable to load this as well, but we're going to show you, how to do that with the Rails credentials, because that's the typical place you would put stuff like that. You could also do env Stripe signing secret or Rails credentials if you want to override that with your environment variables. Then we will use the Stripe gem. We'll say webhook signature verify header. This takes several different things. First, it takes the payload, the request body, because this is kind of what it uses to, that's the actual data they're sending you. So they want to verify that data was not modified at all. So that we need to give it that payload. Then we need to give it the signature that Stripe sent us and our secret. And we'll make sure that it's a string. So we'll say secret to S. And we can also specify a tolerance, because there can be timing attacks and other things that Stripe wants to make sure that is handled properly. And this is a default value that is in the gem. So default tolerance. And then that is going to raise an error if it is not valid. So we can rescue from that error, which is Stripe signature verification error. And if that happens, we want to say bad request. And that's it. So we will implement that verification like so. If you're processing webhooks for other services, you might want to do this in a loop and have multiple different signing secrets in your application so that it can process multiple of those. So you might want to change this a little bit. But what this will do is make sure that the signature and the data are from Stripe and that it could not have been tampered with by anybody else. So that's a real example of how you would verify the event. And we want to do this before we create the background job and the database record, because if this was some malicious user, there's no reason to stash that stuff in the database, and there's no reason to queue up a job for it either. So we want to verify it before it even goes into our database. So that'll make sure it's secure and everything is good there. Now, let's talk about testing a little bit. We're going to make a directory called test fixtures webhooks. And inside of there, we will make a new file under test fixtures webhooks. Make a new file called movie.json. And this is going to be some JSON, of course. Title is the matrix, and our release date or other attributes you might want to add in here, we can put in there and say any value that you would like to simulate the data that they would actually send us over. So then inside of our tests, we can create a test that loads this file and sends that JSON over to us. Let's close this and go into fixture or test controllers webhooks, movies controller test, and define an example test here. So we can have our setup block. Set up. This setup block can take that file path, and we can say Rails root join test fixtures webhooks movie.json, and then our event or webhook or whatever we want to call this would be json.parse file.read file path. And then now we have our Ruby hash that simulates the JSON that would come from our service. So here we can say should consume webhook. And this would be a post request to the webhooks movies URL. And then our params would be at webhook. We would send that data over to our Rails application, and we want to assert response okay. We can also do some other things, like we could assert difference inbound webhook.count to make sure that a new record was added to our database. And we can run this test in our terminal. Test controllers, webhooks, movies, controller test. And if we do everything right, we'll get 2 assertions. So our assert difference and our assert response, and a successful passing test. So we can also go in here as well and add the assert enqueued job. Assert enqueued job. And I think we may have to include a module to make that run. So we'll go Google search for that real quick. I always have to remember this active job test helper. So include this module in our class here. Assert enqueued jobs 1, so it's plural, so we'll use that. Basically, to use this in your code, you'll go in here and say include active job test helper, and then assert enqueued jobs 1. So that will make sure that a job was enqueued in the background with, active job. Anything like Sidekick or whatever might be actually using that in production, but this in the test environment, we'll just queue them up, and then you can use the test helpers here to actually execute them if you want. So you can say perform enqueued jobs. You could then check that background or the inbound webhook database model and make sure it was marked as processed successfully. And you can do more thorough tests to make sure that everything is working correctly. But in general, when we receive a webhook, we want to make sure it verifies correctly. We want to make sure it created that record in the database and enqueued the job. So if we were to do a similar test, say should not consume webhook if verification failed, we can use that parameter and we can say fail verification is 1. We want no difference on this, so we'll say assert no different, assert enqueued jobs is 0, and we want this to be a bad request for that. So if we run this now, we'll have the reverse test for that as well. So we have the success case and the failure case if verification was incorrect. So that works really nicely. Now, there are a lot of other things that you want to consider here. So this is just kind of a taste of consuming webhooks in general. You have this process where you do the verification, create it in the database, queue up a background job, and give a response back to that service. Now, there are all kinds of things here. You can do replay attacks. So if a user was able to intercept a subscription created event, they could send that over to you a couple times. When after their subscription lapsed, they could pretend to create a new subscription. That would be a case where your Stripe controller would have a valid event and maybe a valid signature even, but the tolerance will say, hey, this happened like a month ago, so we shouldn't treat that as valid. So it's important to keep in mind as well, the verification of your webhooks need to make sure that they are not being replayed. There are things where a user might have a subscription created, and you might end up going into your Stripe job and creating duplicate customers, duplicate charges, duplicate subscriptions in case something went wrong. Maybe the job failed and got retried. You want to make sure that these jobs are idempotent, however that is pronounced, but it is important to make sure that you use often find or creates in here. Sometimes you might receive a charge refunded before a charge was created. And if you did that out of order, the refunded might say, oh, I didn't see that in the database. Let me go create that. And then we'll mark it as refunded. But then the charge created would come in and say, oh, I found it in the database. Let me just go update that to the data I have. So the data coming from your webhooks could be stale. So it's important to keep in mind so that when those two events come through, they should go and ask the Stripe API for the latest information. That way, they're not accidentally saving old data to the database. Things can change, and your webhooks, when they fail to be delivered, like a Stripe webhook might take a couple days to be delivered to your application if things were failing, and you might have very outdated information when it comes through. So you may not be able to trust the information they send you. You might need to go look that up to verify that it is accurate. When things are retried, our controller, if it does not send that okay, it will be retried server from the server side on Stripe's end or the webhook services end. So they will keep track of that. Make sure that it's a 200 okay when you don't want to receive it anymore. Anything else, it will retry it. And they will send it to you again. So if your application was down or broken for a little while, they will do their best to give you a few more attempts to deliver that. And then your controller has the background job. So if anything fails in the Stripe job, maybe you made a typo or something's wrong, your job will fail, and then Sidekick or whatever you use to process your jobs should retry that automatically as well. So you have the chance to deploy updates. If these fail, you can mark the status as failed and then set up something to monitor those and then retry them later on. Or, if it's a bug in your code, you can always go and manually find those based upon the status and rerun them. So this is up to you to kind of expand from here. There are all kinds of different things to keep in mind as you build webhooks, but that is all of the basics. There is a website called webhooks.fyi that I would highly recommend checking out. They have all kinds of details like the asymmetric keys for security or HMACs or shared secret or one-time verification, you name it. There are lots and lots of options for these. They do an excellent job of kind of giving you the high-level examples of how this stuff works. The other thing I will mention is that Rails itself uses the exact same pattern that we do in this workshop or this lesson on GoRails. If you go into Action Mailbox, this is receiving webhooks for inbound emails. So when you send an email to something that will process that, like you send it to Postmark, the email will be received by Postmark, then converted into a webhook and sent to your Rails application. And that will go into your app controllers, Action Mailbox, ingresses for Postmark. And they have their own controller for that knows how to authenticate with a password instead. So we have a Rails secret for our password, and they put that as the username and password in the route for your webhooks on Postmark. You could do the same thing as well for your webhooks too. And then they will go and find the data however they need to, and then create a database record and background job to process that. So this Action Mailbox inbound email is what does that. If we go into App Models Action Mailbox inbound email, we have all of that in here as well. So this is where they've got the payload. They know how to take the payload and create a mail object out of that, which is pretty neat. They have a couple modules, what they put in that stuff, or move the logic around a little bit. So after create, they will have it create in the background job instead of doing that directly in the controller. They also set up incineratable so that after this is updated as processed, they will schedule a job to delete itself later on. So it's highly, highly recommended that you read through the Action Mailbox logic as well. to see how all of that works, because it's pretty neat. It's very similar to everything we did. Ours is a little bit more straightforward. We don't have modules hiding things away, but Rails does that exact same pattern for production. So you know that this will scale very well. If you have concerns about scaling, you could actually set up these routes to be processed separate from your main application. So you might deploy 2 copies of your main app, one just to handle your webhooks, and you could have that even in a separate database. So it could be independent from your other code, and your background jobs could be talking to both as needed to process the webhook. And then you could also have a different queue for all of your webhook processing. So all your infrastructure for webhooks could be separate from your main Rails app if you wanted to. But that's kind of out of the scope of processing webhooks. At a basic level, this will get you very, very, very far and isn't too fancy. It's all pretty straightforward and easy to work with and easy to add in another service. You'll make a controller, you make a job, and you're done. That's all you need to do. So take a look at our GitHub repository if you'd like to see any other details. If you run into any issues, use the issues or discussions on GitHub, and we'll happily answer your questions and give you some advice on how you would handle, authentication for something complicated or whatever it might be related to processing and consuming inbound webhooks. So that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll see us at the next RailsConf and giving a talk or workshop then. So that's it for this episode. Talk to you then. Peace.